this one we're going to do some writing of linear equations. So basically we've done some things where we've learned how to find the pieces, parts, and what they mean in an equation. Now we want to be able to go the other direction. So if we have the little pieces and components, we want to be able to see what is the equation that goes with that. So we're going to do a few examples that pertain to your lesson today. All right, first example. So I'm going to draw a little graph and kind of just give you an idea of what that looks like, because this is what they're going to give you. So we're going to have a graph of something, and they're going to give us some points on that graph, and they will label them. And ask us to write an equation in slope-intercept form. So write the equation in slope-intercept form. So we have to remind ourselves what is slope-intercept form. And so slope-intercept form is the format y equals mx plus b. So basically we have to get it into y equals format. Okay, so they've given us 2 points. Remember, points are x and y. And in this case, we can do a couple of things. In my drawing, we can't do it so much, but if this was on graph paper, then we would be able to kind of count and look at how far the rise and run are, because m stands for slope, so we need to find the slope. What's another way that we can find the slope? Well, we can use the slope formula. So remember, to find the slope, which is our m in the equation that we're trying to write, it's going to be y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Now, where do these 2's and 1's come from? Well, remember, we have 2 points on here, and so we want to be able to just label them. You can label them however you want. It doesn't matter what you label, just as long as they are consistent. So those are going to be my 1's, and these are going to be my 2's. Now we plug them in. So y2 is 5 minus y1, which is a negative 5. And then x2 is 1 minus x1, which is negative 1. Now what happens when we have 2 negatives? They become a positive. So 5 plus 5 over 1 plus 1. And so 5 plus 5 is 10. 1 plus 1 is 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So our slope is going to be 5. Now we have to find the y-intercept. So we can do this a couple different ways. We can, again, if this was on graph paper, which I don't have available in this program, then you would be able to see where it crosses the y-axis, and we could use that. What if I don't have that, right? Like, so I'm drawing this for you, don't have that. How do I find the y-intercept? So what we can do is a little bit different thing here, and do it algebraically rather than looking at the graph. Because again, we also want to be able to do this when I don't have the graph. I don't want to have to graph everything all the time. All right, so we are going to look at that algebraically now that I have some room. So we can use that point slope form that you will find. Y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. So we know what our x1 and y1 are, which were the -1, -5, and plug those in. So we're going to plug that point into here, and we know our slope. So that's where we're going to plug in our pieces. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So y minus y1, our y1 was -5. Our slope we just found is 5. And then x minus x1, x1 we said was -1. Okay. All right, so now we just have to make it look pretty, right? So let's make it look pretty. First, let me give us some more room so we can do this part to make it look pretty. All right, so double negative becomes positive. So we have y plus 5 equals 5 times, and then double negative becomes plus, so x plus 1. We now want to distribute that 5 to each one. So 5 times x is 5x. 5 times 1 is 5. Looking better already. And again, we want it in slope-intercept form. So we want it to be y equals. So we have this plus 5 here that we need to get rid of. And again, just remembering our solving skills. In order to get rid of plus 5, we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. 5 minus 5 is 0, so we have y equals 5x, and then 5 minus 5 is 0. So technically we have a plus 0 there. We don't necessarily need it. Y equals 5x is sufficient enough, and that's the equation of that line. All right, let's look at another example. So another graph here. And another line that we want to look at. And they give us 1 point here. -2, 1. And in this case, they tell us to write the equation of the line in general form, where the y-intercept, I'm going to abbreviate that, is 7. Okay. Okay, so a couple things here. This one's different. It says general form. General form is in the format of ax plus by equals c. So we have our x and y term on the left side, and then the constants by itself on the right. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we know a couple things. We know our y-intercept is at 7, so we can go ahead and know that if we were to put this in slope-intercept form, we know that our slope is at, not our slope, our b is at 7. So the b part of it is 7. But we need to figure out our slope part of it. And again, two different ways. If this graph were on graph paper, we would be able to kind of count because we would know that our slope intercept is somewhere here and we could count rise over run. That's one way. The other way is if I know that that's a y-intercept, how do I write that as a point? So again, it's y equals, the y-intercept is at 7, that's a y. Well, what is x? 0. Notice that point didn't go anywhere on the x, so it's at 0. So we have 2 points, so we can use the slope formula to go ahead and find the slope. So y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And again, it doesn't matter what you label them. You can label them however you want. As far as which ones are the 1s and which ones are the 2s. I'll make this x1 and y1. I'll make this x2 and y2, just so we can be clear. All right, so y2 is 7 minus y1, which is 1. And our x2 is 0 minus our x1, which is a negative 2. Again, watch very carefully with your signs. Okay, so 7 minus 1 is 6. And then we have 0 minus a negative 2, so that becomes 0 plus 2. So 0 plus 2 is 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So we know m is 3. All right. So now that we know that, we can now write our equation. Let's get some room here for us to do that. And again, our goal is to write it in the general form. So we'll get to that in just a second. All right, so now we have all of our pieces. If we use y equals mx plus b, we now have m and we have b. So let's go ahead and write our equation in this format. So y equals, slope is 3 and our b is 7. And we would be totally golden right now if it said slope-intercept form, but it wants it in general form. So that means that we need the x and y on the left side and our constant on the right. So notice this x term needs to move to the left. Now, how do we do that? Well, same way we do anything else when we're moving it across, we want to do the opposite. So notice it's a positive. So to undo a positive, we subtract. So we're going to subtract 3x from both sides. So now we have negative 3x plus y equals 7. Now, this would be completely fine, and sometimes the system will take it. However, this time they might not, because there's a negative out here. So if there's a negative in front and you put this into your lesson and it doesn't take it, what you have to do is multiply the whole thing by a negative 1 to get the first term to not be negative. All right, so if negative 1 times a negative 3 becomes a positive 3, a negative 1 times a positive y becomes a negative y, and then 7 times negative 1 is negative 7. So these are identical. It's just a matter of this one looks just a little bit more desirable because there's not a negative in the start. So that would be in general form for that one. All right, let's look at another example. So another graph here. Let's get that drawn. And so here's our line that we are trying to figure out what the equation is for this guy. They tell us that the x-intercept is 2. And they want us to write the equation in slope-intercept form. Okay, so again, couple things we can do. We have an x-intercept. Notice when we write slope-intercept form, we usually have a y-intercept, so this one's a bit unusual. Now, if we think about this, what is the slope of this guy? So if I were to pick 2 points on this particular line, an x-intercept would mean that this point is at the point 2, 0. And if I pick another point anywhere else, like let's say up here, then this point would be like 5, 0, or 5, 0. No, that's not what I wanted. It would be at the point 2, 5. Okay. So let's take a look at what this means. So if I pick another point that's on the line, figure out where that is. Let's do our slope formula to figure it out. So what does that look like? Again, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we're going to have 5 minus 0 over 2 minus 2. 5 minus 0 is 5. 2 minus 2 is 0. What happens if I take 5 divided by 0? Remember, you can always put it in your calculator to see what happens. Well, I will assure you that when I plug this into my calculator, it will tell me I have an error, right? We can't divide by 0. So in this case, the slope on this one is actually considered undefined. Okay? It has an undefined slope. And notice that no matter what point I pick, the x is going to be 2. So even if I picked a point down here, it would still be 2 something, 2 negative 3. So no matter what, the y doesn't matter, right? It doesn't change the x. And so in this case, this one's a very weird one. If I have a vertical line like this, it has undefined slope. And whenever I write the equation, this is the only one that's weird where we're going to have x equals. And in this case, it's going to be that same as what the x-intercept is. X equals 2. Okay, so that one's just a little strange. All right, one more example for you. And again, we have a graph. This one, I'm going to go ahead and put in the tick marks so we can count. Here's our y-axis and here's our x-axis. All right, and we need to draw our equation. Okay, so here they give us our equation. Now we want to write the equation in slope-intercept form. Okay, so in order to write slope-intercept form, we need a y-intercept and we need a slope. So, what to do? Well, in this case, we can actually count for slope. We don't have to do the slope equation. Remember, slope is also rise over run. So we have to count how many does it go up versus how many does it go over. So from this point on the top to the point on the bottom, how many does it go up? So let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 spaces between the two. And then how many spaces does it go over? So looks like 1. So remember, slope is the same as rise over run. So it rose 7. Now, did it rise or did it fall? That's a good question. So in this case, if I'm reading this like I read a book, left to right, if I go from the top point to the bottom point, did I go up or did I go down? And in this case, I went down. So in going down, that means we didn't really rise, we fell, which is totally fine. It just means that we have a negative. So it would be a -7 because it fell over 1. -7 divided by 1 is -7. So our slope here would be -7. Awesome. Now, our next step is to find the y-intercept. Okay, so notice our graph isn't quite complete. We can't tell down here at the bottom of this graph where this is actually crossing in order to just be quick and easy and know where the y-intercept is. So how do I find it otherwise? Well, notice we want to write our equation y equals mx plus b. And right now we know our m, but we also have a point on the graph. So on this case, we can look and we say, oh, well, This point right here actually has a coordinate, and it's at -2, 3. And notice every coordinate is going to be x and y. So what I'm going to do is plug in that point for the x and the y in the equation and plug in the m that I just found, and I'm going to solve for b. All right, so our y is going to be 3. Our m we just found was -7. Our x is -2, and then plus b. Now, we have to do our multiplication. So -7 times a -2 is going to be a +14. And then we need to get b all by itself. So to get b all by itself, we need to get rid of the 14. So we're going to subtract 14 from both sides. And then 3 minus 14 is -11. That's 0. So b is -11. Awesome. Now we can write our equation. So what does our equation look like? Well, let's give us some room so we can just kind of complete the circle here and write our equation. So now we just plug in the b and we plug in the m. So we have y equals -7x minus 11. And you're all done. So that's it for this lesson. Again, if you run into questions when you're working on your lesson that these examples pertain to, don't forget to ask your teacher. Thanks. Have a great day.